Helen never thought she would have to start over at the age of 72. She had always been the quiet backbone of the family, the one behind warm meals, clean clothes, and sleepless nights when the children were sick or her husband was unwell. For over 40 years, Helen lived with a simple belief. If she loved enough, sacrificed enough, then family would always be the safest place. But everything began to fall apart after the sudden death of her husband, Richard. The funeral ended, the house grew cold, but the deeper chill came from her own flesh and blood. The family meeting to discuss the inheritance had not a moment of silence or sharing. Caroline, the eldest daughter, whom Helen had scraped and saved to put through medical school, opened the meeting with a list of assets to be divided. The house, her father's car, the antique porcelain set, even the old piano in the living room. "You don't really use this anymore, Mom," Caroline said with an awkward smile, though her eyes weren't joking. Helen sat there, silent. No one asked her what she wanted. No one asked how she would live, now that everything she'd been attached to for decades was being split up like items in a storage room. 2 days later, Caroline called. "Mom, we've talked it over. You'll stay with us for a while, okay? Just for now. We'll figure things out later." Helen stayed quiet. Caroline continued, faster this time, as if afraid to be interrupted. "We're really busy. The house isn't that big, so you'll have to stay in the shed behind the garden for a while. We'll have it fixed up with electricity and water. The shed." The place Helen once used to store old things, occasionally tidying it up on quiet days, was now where she would temporarily stay. "Just for now," Caroline emphasized. No one asked if her back would hurt on a low bed. No one remembered that she'd had knee surgery. No one mentioned those old family breakfasts or the cookies she used to bake for her grandchildren on holidays. Helen moved into Caroline's house 3 days later. The shed had been cleaned out with a foldable bed, a small table, and an old ceiling fan that rattled every time it spun. For the first time in her life, Helen felt like an object that had been misplaced, an unnecessary item in her own daughter's home. In the days that followed, things became even clearer. Caroline jokingly called her the senior maid when asking her to babysit, cook, clean. Every month, she was asked to pay a living fee from her pension. Not much, just enough to make her feel like she was paying rent for the right to stay. One evening, Helen accidentally overheard a conversation between Caroline and her husband. Through the thin window pane, the words hit her like an icy slap. "I've told Mom so many times. She should go to a nursing home. She can't stay here forever. I want the shed back so the kid can practice piano in there. Once she sells that wedding ring, she'll go." Helen froze. The wedding ring, it was the last thing she had kept after her husband's passing. That night, she sat on the hard bed, hugging herself. The tears came silently, not from heartbreak, but from the horrible realization that she had given her whole life to people who never understood the love she had given. The next morning, before the sunlight reached the shed, Helen made a phone call to an old friend, Deborah, who used to be the secretary at the high school where Helen had taught sewing. "Deborah, I need a place to start over. Do you still remember me?" On the other end of the line, Deborah was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Of course I do, Helen. And I think maybe it's time you started living for yourself." Helen packed a few clothes, a few small keepsakes. She left her wedding ring on the table, along with a handwritten note, "Thank you for showing me it's time to stand up." Helen moved into the so-called renovated storage room on a bitterly cold October afternoon. The walls still smelled damp, the ceiling was low, and light could only squeeze in through a narrow crack in the metal door. There were no windows, no curtains, no morning birdsong like in her old house. Only the sound of hurried footsteps from afar, and occasionally the giggles of children from the main house, the place she had once hoped would be her new home. But from the day Helen arrived, every dinner was just a tray of food left at her door, sometimes already cold. No one invited her to eat with them. No round table, no clinking of glasses, no, "Did you enjoy the meal, Mom?" Helen tried to console herself, telling herself her daughter was busy, that it was all just temporary. But as the days passed, the truth stood out like the cracks on the wall. She was a stranger in her own family. Caroline and her husband only knocked when they needed her to babysit or cook. In those moments, Helen did everything silently, without complaint, without anger. She feared that if she spoke up, she would only be seen more as a burden. At first, she still called her two sons. One lived in Texas, the other worked in Florida, but the calls grew shorter. "I'm in a meeting, Mom. Call you later, okay? Ask Caroline next time. I'm not sure." After a few weeks, she stopped calling. The little room became Helen's entire world. She hung her old wedding photo on the wall, placed a small vase of flowers by the bed. Tiny details, but all she had to remind herself that she was still a person with feelings, not just an old item placed somewhere out of the way. Every night, when the living room light shone through the door crack, she could hear laughter, the clink of cutlery, the sound of TV shows, the sound of family, but no longer her family. One night, Helen woke up in the middle of the night. The light in the living room was still on. She tiptoed to the wooden door, pressing her ear against it as she heard whispered voices. Caroline's voice, clear and cold. "Don't you think my mom's like a shadow? Always so quiet, staring. I really feel guilty, but it's not like we're obligated to take care of her forever." Her husband replied, his voice tired. "I've told you already. Putting her in a nursing home is the best solution. Did you check out that place in the suburbs? It's cheap, and they have a senior discount program." Caroline sighed. "I just don't want people saying I'm ungrateful. But keeping her here like this, it's just too cramped." Helen stood frozen, her heart clenched. The words kept echoing in her mind. Put her away. Cheap, too cramped. Not once. Not one word of love. No one remembered what she had done. Skipping meals to feed her children, staying up all night with sick grandkids, holding back tears so her daughter could study abroad, succeed. Tears welled up, bitter and silent. They slid down her wrinkled cheeks, one by one. She returned to bed, pulling the blanket over herself like a child afraid of the dark. But this time, the scariest shadows came from her own family. The next day, she didn't speak to anyone. Caroline didn't notice. She only knocked at 7 a.m. to hand Helen a shopping list. Diapers for the baby, vegetables, floor cleaner. Helen took the paper, nodded, and quietly walked to the bus stop. On the ride, she watched other elderly people, some going grocery shopping, some meeting friends, some with grandkids on their laps, and she suddenly felt lost from the world. No longer a mother, no longer a wife, no longer a teacher, just a nameless shadow. When she returned, she placed the bags on the table. No one said thank you. Caroline walked by and said, "Why'd you buy so many vegetables? Ask me next time, okay?" Helen gave a faint smile, a smile, drained of feeling. That night, she called Deborah. She didn't cry, didn't complain. She simply asked gently, "Deborah, do you still mean it, the invitation to visit that senior community?" On the other end, Deborah hesitated for a moment, then replied warmly, "Of course, come. I'll have a room ready. And Helen, here, no one is a burden." That afternoon, a light drizzle fell like threads from the sky, gently landing on the worn path through the park. Helen wrapped her worn, frayed cardigan tightly around herself, bracing against the chill of early autumn. She had no clear destination, only a need for an excuse to leave that damp little room, if only for a while. The park was nearly empty. A few stone benches were speckled with rain, a handful of pigeons huddled under the eaves for shelter. Helen chose her usual spot beneath the flame tree, where she and her husband used to stroll in their younger days. The wind brushed through her hair, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and a trace of old memories. As she sat, lost in thought, a gentle voice called out behind her, "Helen, is that you?" She turned around, needing a few seconds to recognize the face, lined with age, yet still radiant. "Deborah?" Helen gasped softly, then chuckled. "Goodness, how many years has it been?" Deborah, her old friend from their days teaching at Maple Hill Elementary, stood there with a large blue umbrella and a bag of fresh oranges in hand. She still had that familiar openness in her expression, that warm look in her eyes, and a voice untouched by the distance of time. "You still come to the park when it rains, don't you?" Deborah asked, smiling fondly. Helen nodded, and the two sat close beneath the umbrella, falling easily into reminiscing. They spoke of mischievous students, of their no-nonsense but kind-hearted principal, of teacher workshops that had been more laughter than lecture. Then Deborah gave Helen a longer, more thoughtful look. "You look tired. Are you okay?" Helen didn't answer right away. She glanced up at the fading rain, like her own life, once full of responsibilities, love, hope, now thinning out into silence. At last she sighed. Maybe it's just loneliness. Deborah didn't press. She understood. As women, as mothers, as lifelong teachers, they both knew what it meant to sacrifice, to smile through tears. Deborah gently placed a hand on Helen's shoulder. Hey, where I live, there's still a room available. It's not a nursing home, I promise. It's a senior living community. We grow veggies, cook together, have yoga classes, book clubs. Helen smiled faintly. Sounds like heaven. Not heaven, Deborah said, squeezing her friend's shoulder. But it's a place where people respect each other, where we live with each other, not just next to each other. Come stay for a few weeks, just for a change of pace. If it's not your thing, I'll drive you back myself. Helen didn't reply. She wasn't used to accepting help, much less leaving her daughter's house. But at that moment, she couldn't stop the image of the damp room in her mind, the laughter echoing far from the living room, and that cold phrase, put her in a cheap nursing home. She inhaled deeply, then nodded. The trip to Deborah's community was the first time Helen had felt nervous in ages. But it wasn't fear, it was the kind of fluttering a child feels on their first day of school, holding a parent's hand. Greenhaven wasn't at all what Helen had imagined. Tucked away in a quiet suburb, the place was a compact yet vibrant complex. Bright flowers lined the walkways, birds chirped each morning, and elderly couples pruned plants, painted, or stretched under shaded porches. Deborah showed her around, the cozy common room with a fireplace, the central kitchen filled with the scent of toasted bread. Everyone she introduced was kind. No one asked where Helen came from or why. They simply said, "So nice to meet you, and there's always room here for good people." Helen was given a small but clean room with a window overlooking the garden. For the first time in months, she watched the sunrise from bed, breathed fresh morning air, and heard someone call her name warmly, not because they needed something, but simply to invite her to breakfast. That night, Helen sat on the porch with Deborah, sipping tea under the soft glow of a lantern. "Do you think I'm terrible?" Helen asked quietly. "For leaving without saying anything. What will my daughter think?" Deborah rested her hands on the warm mug, answering slowly, "Helen, sometimes it's not about leaving. It's about finally coming home, to yourself." Helen gazed out toward the garden, where an elderly couple walked hand in hand beneath the trees, and for the first time in her life, she realized something she'd never dared to believe before. Maybe she didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. Helen never imagined that at the age of 72, she would experience a new beginning. On her first morning at Greenhaven, she awoke not to the jarring sound of Caroline slamming doors or the blaring TV in the living room, but to the gentle sunlight filtering through the window. The only sounds were birdsong and the faint clink of spoons against teacups from the community kitchen. Deborah knocked lightly on the door. "I've signed us up for the morning yoga class. You awake yet, you lazy friend?" Helen laughed, a real laugh, not the forced kind. She slipped into soft, simple clothes and stepped outside, as if shedding the dust that had coated her heart for months. The yoga class was held outdoors, on soft grass shaded by ancient trees. The instructor was a tall, slender man with silver hair. He didn't push anyone to twist uncomfortably. Instead, he gently guided them to breathe, to listen to their bodies, and to quiet their minds. Helen couldn't remember the last time she had taken a deep breath. These past months, she had been living as if holding her breath, just trying not to disturb anyone, not to be cast aside, not to fall apart. Now even a single deep breath moved her to stillness. Every day at Greenhaven was a gentle invitation. Lunch together, reading together, watching old black and white movies together. No one asked where she had come from. No one pried into her past. Here, she wasn't a burden. She was Miss Helen. People called her name, not to assign chores, but to invite her for a walk, to play a game of chess, or simply to ask, "Did you sleep well last night?" Deborah showed her the communal kitchen, where a few elderly women were making cookies. They laughed, told stories, and dabbed flour on each other's noses like mischievous girls. Helen felt her heart soften. She had once known moments like these, long ago, before life became just obligations. One afternoon, Deborah invited Helen to the reading nook beneath the old oak tree. "You used to be so handy. Remember those little dresses you made for your students?" Deborah said casually, though her voice was full of meaning. Helen paused. She remembered the cute little dresses made from scrap fabric, mending coats for coworkers, the evenings spent sewing costumes for school plays. That was before the weight of family erased her personal joys, back when her hands were nimble and her heart eager. Deborah smiled. There's a lady here named Louise. She has severe arthritis and struggles with buttons. One day she said, I wish I had a shirt I didn't have to fasten. I thought, you could make something, couldn't you? Helen didn't answer right away, but that night she opened her old suitcase and found the sewing kit she had packed more out of habit than hope. Under the soft glow of the lamp, she pulled out some fabric scraps and began to cut. Her hands weren't as fast as they once were, but the feeling, it was still there. Each stitch felt like mending her own soul, slow, patient, and full of love. A few days later, she gave the first shirt to Louise. It was simple, with soft folds and Velcro instead of buttons, designed so Louise wouldn't have to lift her arms too high. Louise tried it on, her eyes misting as she exclaimed, Oh my goodness, it fits perfectly, like it was made just for me. From then on, people began asking Helen to help with alterations, to sew dresses, to embroider handkerchiefs. She became the seamstress of the community, a title given not formally, but lovingly. But what warmed Helen's heart the most was one quiet evening when someone knocked on her door simply to say, Miss Helen, I made apple pie. Would you like to come share some? Not because she was useful, not because she was someone's mother, just because she was her, and that was enough. That night, Helen sat on the porch as a cool breeze brushed through her hair. Deborah brought out 2 cups of chamomile tea and sat beside her. You know, Deborah said softly, I used to think life after 70 was just waiting. Waiting to get sick, waiting for a call from the kids, waiting to die. Helen smiled. And now? Deborah lifted her teacup. Now I think, this is the part of life where I live most honestly. No need to prove anything. No need to serve anyone. Just feel. Helen nodded. She had never imagined that in the midst of aging, loss, and loneliness, she could find a place where she was welcomed simply for being herself. And once again, she could do what she loved, not out of duty, but out of joy. Helen had never thought she would start over, at the age of 72. But now she felt as if she had found a part of herself that had been forgotten for many years. A part she thought had long died when the worries and responsibilities of family took over everything. One cool morning, when the warm sunlight shone through the window, she stepped into her small room at Greenhaven, where she had found peace. On the old table, a sewing machine had been borrowed by Deborah from the community's shared storage. The sewing machine was old, seemingly used for many years, but when she looked at it, her heart was filled with a familiar feeling, a feeling of coming home. Helen placed her hand on the machine, feeling its resilience. This sensation reminded her of the old days when she was a wife, a mother, and even a teacher. She had sewn beautiful dresses for her students, for the young girls in the village, and even made small clothes for her own children. A sigh escaped her lips. Helen didn't know where to start. Her hands were no longer as quick as before, but they were still patient. The fabric Deborah had brought to her were scraps from old projects in the community. They were full of colors and patterns, but mostly old pieces, no longer as fresh as the beautiful clothes she once sewed for her daughter Caroline. But that didn't matter. For Helen, each piece of fabric was an opportunity to start anew, to rediscover her passion. She took the needle and thread, carefully threading it through the needle's eye, and began sewing again from the scraps of fabric. The first stitches were slow, but gradually they became steady and sure. She began to feel the rebirth in each stitch. The worries about the past, about the children who had turned their backs on her, seemed to fade away in the fresh air of this place. One day, while chatting with Deborah, she heard about Irene, an elderly woman in the community who had Parkinson's disease and struggled with dressing herself. Helen suddenly had an idea. Why not make Irene a dress that would make it easier for her to put it on? With patience, she began the task. She chose a piece of fabric that was soft yet sturdy, beautiful enough for Irene to feel comfortable and still look lovely. But the special thing was that the dress wouldn't have buttons or zippers, which were difficult to manage. Instead, she decided to use magnetic clasps, a simple but extremely effective solution for people with health issues. Helen didn't remember how long it took her to make the dress, but she clearly remembered the feeling when the dress was finished. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of her return to herself, a milestone of rebirth in her life. When the dress was completed, Helen carefully handed it to Deborah, asking her to give it to Irene to try on. She didn't know what to expect. She just hoped that Irene would feel the love and care she had put into every stitch. The next day, Irene came to see her. Irene's eyes sparkled as she walked into the room, wearing the new dress. Helen saw the bright smile on Irene's face, and in that moment, she felt something deeply profound. Irene wasn't just wearing a beautiful dress. She had regained the feeling of being a confident, beautiful woman, even though illness had taken so much from her life. "For the first time in 10 years, I feel like a lady," Irene said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Helen. I don't know how to express my feelings." Helen looked at Irene, speechless. She only felt a warm sensation spreading in her heart. It was the feeling of success, of bringing value to others, the feeling of rediscovering a passion she had long forgotten. The next day, Irene came back wearing the new dress, not just because it was easier to wear, but because it made her feel more beautiful. Others in the community began asking Helen if she could make similar things for them. Elderly people, each with their own difficulties, from not being able to button their clothes to struggling to wash without pain. But with the dresses and simple yet creative clothing Helen made, they felt their lives became easier and more complete. Helen began to feel that she wasn't just sewing for others, she was helping them regain their dignity, confidence, and hope. A feeling she had never experienced during the years of being neglected, rejected by her own children. One day, Deborah came to her with good news. "You know, many people in the community want to buy your clothes. I think you should consider starting your own project, sewing clothes for the elderly, maybe clothes that are easy to wear and use. There will definitely be a lot of people who need them." Helen didn't reply immediately, but she could feel the encouragement in Deborah's words. This was an opportunity not just to help others, but also to find herself again, to realize that her worth was not defined by the children who had abandoned her, but by the good things she could bring to this world. As the days passed, Helen's life at the Greenhaven community had changed in a miraculous way. Once a woman who felt abandoned and worthless, she was now an integral part of the community, not only because of her sewing skills, but also due to the love she shared with those around her. Yet, Helen still felt the need to do more. She wanted to do something bigger, not just for herself, but for all the other elderly women in the community who were also rediscovering their own worth. One day, while sitting by her sewing machine, Deborah came to visit with a new idea. Deborah looked at Helen, smiled gently, and said, "You know, Helen, I think you could build a little brand for yourself. Don't just sew shirts and pants for the people in the community. You could share your creations with the world. Start by creating a Facebook page." Helen was a bit surprised by Deborah's suggestion. She wasn't very tech-savvy, and her entire life had been focused on manual crafts, creating things by hand without the need for technology. However, Deborah's persistence and determination eventually convinced her. After a few evenings with Deborah's help, Helen had a Facebook page named From Mother's Hands, where she began to share her designs: dresses, shirts, pants for the elderly, simple yet functional and beautiful garments. At first, Helen didn't expect much. She just wanted people to see her creations so she could help more people. But something unexpected happened. Her old friends in the community began sharing her page. Then, through acquaintances, orders started to come in from afar. Every time she received an order, Helen felt like she had more motivation to work, as though a new energy was filling her. One of the first orders came from an elderly mother in another city who had seen her Facebook page and decided to order an easy-to-wear shirt for herself. Understanding the importance of the item to her, Helen not only made the shirt but also included a handwritten letter. "I hope this shirt will make you feel more comfortable and joyful. We all deserve to be loved and respected." The small but heartfelt gift deeply moved the customer, and she sent back a sincere thank you. It was the first time Helen realized that her products didn't just bring convenience, but also carried love and care. This was the moment she understood that she could change someone's life with simple items filled with emotion. Day by day, orders from afar increased. Some people ordered dresses, others woolen sweaters, and there were those who simply sent thank you letters for the easy-to-wear, convenient items Helen had created. Each order marked a new milestone in her journey, and every shirt and pair of pants carried a story of connection and love. One day, she received a call from a rehabilitation center. They needed a large number of clothes for their patients, especially for those with disabilities or elderly people who had difficulty dressing. They had heard about Helen's products and wanted to place an order. It was a great opportunity, but also a big challenge for her. She had never worked on such a large order, but she knew this was her chance to prove her worth. Helen didn't hesitate to accept. She got to work with all the care and dedication she had always put into her sewing. Easy-to-wear shirts, dresses with magnetic zippers, and comfortable pants were all completed in a short time as promised. When the order was delivered to the rehabilitation center, the feedback from the clients moved Helen deeply. Her items not only provided convenience, but also helped those in need feel more confident in taking care of themselves. One elderly woman said, "I feel like I'm alive again. These shirts are not only easy to wear, but they're also so beautiful. I can put them on by myself without help." The success of her first large order gave Helen a boost. She began to think about expanding further. With the help of Deborah and a few friends in the community, Helen decided to start a sewing class for her elderly friends in the community. She wanted to share her skills, give everyone the opportunity to learn, and create items that would make their lives easier. On the first day of the sewing class, 5 elderly women attended. They sat around a large table, listening as Helen taught them how to use a sewing machine and the basic techniques. Everyone laughed and chatted happily, and the atmosphere in the class was filled with joy. Helen felt happiness not just from helping herself, but also from empowering others. She realized that sewing was not just a craft. It was a way to connect, to build community, and to help each person rediscover their own value. A year had passed since Helen began her new life, and her life had completely changed. After so many years of living in the shadows of loneliness and abandonment, she had now become a woman of value, not thanks to the people around her, but because of herself. The days spent in the Greenhaven community had brought her a new life, full of energy and hope. The dresses and easy-to-wear clothes she created not only helped the people in the community, but also changed her own life. Helen was sitting at her work table, the old sewing machine running steadily, when she suddenly heard a knock on the door. She looked up and saw a familiar figure. Caroline, her eldest daughter, was standing at the door, with Megan, her granddaughter, by her side. Both of them seemed somewhat hesitant. A sense of unease passed through Helen's heart, but she smiled and gently said, "Come in, dear." Caroline stepped in, looking a bit flustered, and Megan followed. Helen invited them to sit down, then made a pot of fragrant tea. Everything in the room radiated peace, from the dresses hanging on the wall to the thank you letters neatly arranged on the table. Helen was in no hurry, allowing the silence to settle in the room. Caroline looked around, her gaze lingering for a long time on the dresses Helen had sewn herself. She looked at the thank you letters from customers who had received Helen's gifts, and an overwhelming feeling stirred within her. Caroline didn't know what to say, just stood there silently. Finally, she spoke in a strange voice. "I didn't expect you to be able to do this." Caroline's words carried some surprise, but there was no remorse or sense of regret. She simply acknowledged what Helen had done, but without showing any longing to correct past mistakes. Helen didn't answer immediately. She gently poured tea, looked at her cup, and let the memories of the past drift by. After a while, she looked up at Caroline and said, "I did this for myself, not to prove anything to you." It was a gentle yet powerful statement. There was no bitterness, no accusations. Helen didn't need to say much because she understood that what she did was for herself, not for the recognition of anyone else, even her own children. Caroline fell silent, saying nothing more. She looked at the dresses, at the thank you letters, then back at her mother. Her mind drifted through the years that had passed, the times she had abandoned Helen, the cold words she had once spoken. But now, seeing her mother changed and become a completely different person, Caroline didn't know what to say. She couldn't apologize for the past mistakes, and perhaps she didn't know how to reconnect with her mother after everything that had happened. Megan, Helen's granddaughter, was the only one in the room who didn't remain silent. She looked at her grandmother, her eyes filled with surprise and admiration. "Grandma, you make beautiful things. My friends at school wear clothes you make." Megan's praise was like a breath of fresh air cutting through the tense atmosphere. Helen smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Thank you, dear. I'm so happy to know you like these things. I've learned a lot too by making them." The little girl looked at her with loving eyes and pride. That was what Helen needed. Not recognition from Caroline, but sincere affection from the people in her community, and especially from her granddaughter. Caroline looked into her mother's eyes, and in that moment, she felt a pang of regret. She hadn't realized that her mother could be so strong. All those years living in the dark, when she had rejected her mother, she never thought that Helen could change and find her own happiness again. Caroline hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I just want to say I'm really surprised. I didn't know you could do this. But I'm not sorry, Mom. I don't know how to apologize." Helen looked into Caroline's eyes, but said nothing. She understood that there were things that couldn't be changed and words that couldn't be spoken. But she didn't need Caroline to apologize. She had grown accustomed to living alone, learning to love herself and do what she wanted without needing recognition from anyone. The conversation between them continued in silence, not because of coldness, but because they both knew that the past couldn't be changed. Helen had rebuilt her life, and now she only wanted to live for herself. After the meeting with Caroline, it seemed that the thoughts in Helen's heart had found a peaceful place within her. She no longer felt confused or sought forgiveness from her children. Her new life was fulfilling, not only with her sewing work and conversations with Deborah, but also with the genuine affection she received from the Greenhaven community and from her granddaughter Megan. Everything was different now. Helen felt she was part of a connected community where people shared not only material things, but also spiritual values, love, and understanding. It was here that she found the peace she had long lost. And despite everything that had happened, she understood that true happiness came from freedom and the ability to stand firm on her own feet. One afternoon, as Helen sat by the window, watching the sunset through the trees, there was a knock at the door. She turned around, and this time, it was Caroline, along with Megan. Both seemed worried. Caroline smiled gently, but the tension in her eyes could not be hidden. "Mom, I think we could live together again. This time, I'll give you a bigger, nicer room, right in the main part of our house," Caroline suggested, her voice gentle but full of anticipation. "I think you'll like it, and I want to be closer to you." Helen looked at Caroline, her eyes not filled with anger or resentment. She only felt an unusual calmness. In that moment, the memories of the past, the times when she had endured coldness and abandonment from her children, passed through her like a fleeting breeze, but no longer stirred her or caused pain. What had happened was in the past, and Helen knew she couldn't go back. She smiled gently and replied, "Here, I've found peace." Helen's response was simple, but it was all she needed to say. She no longer needed to return to the place where she had suffered, where her love had not been appreciated. She understood that it wasn't necessary to live with her children to call it family. Sometimes, family is where one feels loved, respected, and most importantly, free to live the way one wants. Caroline stood still, silent, her eyes still sad. Perhaps she realized that what she proposed could not change the past, and Helen no longer needed her protection. She couldn't give back what her mother had lost over the years. In that quiet moment, Megan, Helen's granddaughter, approached her. She hugged her tightly and whispered in her ear, "I'm proud of you, Grandma." Those words spread a warm wave of affection through Helen's heart. She needed nothing more than that. Not an apology from Caroline, nor a promise of a new life. The sincere affection from her granddaughter was all she needed. Megan understood and saw what Helen had been through. The little girl didn't need to say anything more. Those words were enough for Helen to feel loved and appreciated. Helen gave a soft smile, her eyes shining with the peace she had never had before. She wasn't angry, nor did she hold any resentment towards Caroline or anyone in the family. She didn't feel the need to return to the past, only wanting to continue on the path she had chosen. She had learned an important lesson. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, but about letting go. Forgiveness didn't mean letting the past control her, but allowing herself to live a free life, unbound by past wounds. Caroline stood there, quietly observing her mother, as if she realized that not everything could be undone, and not everything could be fixed. Love and sacrifice weren't always rewarded, and some wounds could only be healed with time and change. After a moment, Caroline sighed and said, "I just want you to be happy." Helen looked at her, her eyes lighting up with a hint of sympathy. "I am happy here, Caroline. I don't need to go back to the place that caused me pain. I've found my happiness, and so have you. Happiness isn't always about closeness. Sometimes it's about freedom and the ability to live the way you want." Caroline could only nod, unable to say anything more. She understood that, no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't change what had happened. Helen had found peace in her own life, and that was what mattered. Megan took Helen's hand and looked into her eyes with affection. "Grandma, I'm so proud of you. I want to be as strong as you when I grow up." Helen smiled, holding her granddaughter. At that moment, she felt a deep joy rise in her heart. She was no longer alone. She had her community, the love of her granddaughter, and most importantly, the freedom and peace in the life she had built for herself. Helen looked out the window, where gentle sunlight streamed into the lush green garden. The grass and flowers swayed in the breeze, and the peaceful atmosphere, full of hope, made her feel as if life was fresher than it had ever been. Her feelings were no longer of loneliness, sorrow, or the pain that once stole the light from her eyes. She had found herself, not through her children, not through acceptance or praise from others, but through her own being. At 72, Helen felt an undeniable vitality. She no longer lived to please anyone. She lived for herself, for the dreams, desires, and values she had discovered throughout her long, challenging journey. Each day, she woke up with a new purpose, not to meet the expectations of others, but to fulfill her own long-held hopes. The sense of freedom and independence had transformed her life completely. Her brand, From Mother's Hands, had become a symbol within the senior community. The garments she created were not just clothes. They were filled with love, care, and deep understanding for those around her. The community saw Helen as a strong woman, not only creative but full of compassion. Each item she crafted carried a story, a memory, or even a spark of hope. Day by day, the number of Helen's customers grew. It wasn't just people in Green Haven anymore. Seniors from other areas had heard about From Mother's Hands and came to her for custom-made, comfortable, and artistic clothing. Her dresses, jackets, pants, and accessories all carried a clear message. Age is not a limitation, but a gateway to live authentically. Those who once believed their golden years had faded now felt youthful, confident, and radiant in the clothes Helen made. The community began to realize that Helen wasn't just selling products, she was sharing spiritual values that many had forgotten. Every dress was a reminder that it's never too late to change, never too late to find yourself. Helen had become a symbol of strength and renewal through hardship. One morning, while she was teaching a new group of students how to sew, Deborah, her close friend, stopped by and watched her with loving eyes. "You've done something you never thought possible," Deborah said, her voice warm and proud. "I remember when you saw yourself as just an old, useless mother who only knew how to sacrifice. But now, you're an independent woman of value, an inspiration to so many." Helen simply smiled. She knew she had changed. The journey hadn't been easy, but it was those very difficulties that had shaped her into a strong and resilient woman. She no longer looked at the past with regret or sadness, but toward the future with optimism and hope. She found her worth in small yet meaningful actions. Words of thanks from customers and heartwarming stories from fellow seniors proved that her choices had been right. Only when we dare to live for ourselves, to change, and to face challenges head-on, do we realize that age isn't a limit. It's an opportunity to expand life's possibilities. One evening, as she sat beside the small fire in her cozy kitchen, Helen reflected on everything she had been through. From her children's rejection, to the lonely days, to the tough beginnings of rebuilding her life in her twilight years. All of it had shaped her into the person she was now, an independent, confident woman living fully for herself. She no longer lived to please anyone, not for society's approval or her family's recognition. She lived for herself, and she knew she deserved a more beautiful chapter of life. I started over at 72, not because I was weak, but because I deserved a better chapter, Helen had once said. And now she didn't need to say it anymore. Every action, every step she took was living proof of that truth. Each morning, when she opened her eyes, she knew she was living a life full of meaning. Not because she was serving her children, not because of anyone's apology, but because she had found peace within herself. And that was what mattered most. Helen understood that freedom isn't just physical, it's spiritual. Freedom is when you can do what you want without hesitation, without fear of what others may think.